Hi, I'm Tom Russell, and when I'm not on the Macs playing some records on the radio, I listen to Glasgow Apollo live.
Now, with a little help from his friends, Philip Differ remembers perhaps the greatest music venue of all time in the Temple of Apollo.
It was an imposing building. It was like no place you'd ever been before.
All I can ever think about are the queues outside that place. That's my memory. God, there must be something on in the Apollo. The town is jumping.
It was like a spiritual experience.
The music seemed just to fill the whole place, and I've never had the feeling of complete immersion in the music that I had when I saw bands play at the Apollo.
You've only got to look at ABBA, Super Trooper. I called you last night from Glasgow. You know, they don't mention London or New York or Hartlepool, and that was they were aware that was the gig on their tour.
It was in Glasgow, and I didn't live in Glasgow. I'm from a housing scheme in Paisley. You know, going to the big city at night time when you're 13, 14, it was a huge adventure. It was brilliant.
20 years ago, the diggers stopped, the trucks left, and where once stood Glasgow's mighty Apollo, there was now a great big hole in the ground. The legend was over, the myth was just beginning. In its day, Green's Playhouse was the biggest cinema in Europe. It stood on Renfield Street in Glasgow, where it looked down on the Pavilion Theatre. It was huge, and it was losing money. Clouds, the aptly named club based in the ballroom perched on top of the auditorium, was, however, turning a profit. The man behind this was Frank Lynch, and he saw an opportunity that he felt had to be taken.
There was rumours going around town that the building was going to be demolished or it was going to be turned into a bingo hall. I was aware of the fact that the cinema was doing really poorly. So anyway, I went to see young George Green. So I said to him, look George, why don't I take this problem off your hands? And instead of just paying you for the club, Clouds up the stair, I'll pay you a fixed fee for the whole building. He got back to me and he says, no, everybody's agreed, we'll go ahead. I was going to be an antidote to the conservative theatre people in Glasgow. And I just felt I want to pick a name that doesn't sound like Her Majesty's or the Queen's or the King's or the Pavilion or the Alhambra, the traditional names. I want to have a name of today. I thought about the 70s, the Americans on the moon, and I just thought it was a cool name. And I also liked the fact that it was a short name, because Green's Playhouse is a very long name, it's a lot to conjure with, and it's also a lot to replace the sign. I talked to the sign company and they told me that letters were £250 per letter. So if I had renamed it or reinstated with a new sign, the name's Green's Playhouse, it would have been 3 times as expensive as the Apollo. And as I didn't really have the money to finish the whole renovation and I was scrambling to put it together, I thought a short name and a name from today was what I would pick, and I just liked the ring of the name Apollo.
Your first gig at this venue was something to be cherished and remembered forever, as regular Apollo goers Francis McDonnell and Laurie McCauley testify.
First time I was there, it was still the Greens, the Playhouse. Elton John, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, was the album, and it was brilliant. And I jumped up and down in my seat, and the seat gave way and went onto the floor, and then I pushed my pal off his and did the same with his, and there were about 3 rows flat on their back when we came out at the end of the concert, because everybody had such a brilliant time.
Status Quo. I would be about 14, so it would be 73, and I think it was May, and it was the tour they did when Piledriver came out, and I just loved Status Quo. I've only seen them live the once, I have to admit, because I grew up after that and went on to slightly more sophisticated things.
For some, though, their first experience was to prove a life-changing event. Billy Sloan.
The first gig I ever went to, and you know it'll be on my tombstone, was the 21st of October 1971. I went to see The Who at the Old Greens Playhouse before it became the Apollo. Seeing my heroes, you know, Keith Moon and Pete Townsend and John Entwistle and Roger Daltrey, 50 feet away in that famous high stage. It was a defining, I know it sounds really dramatic, but it was a defining and life-changing moment. It's the reason that I get into journalism, it's the reason I get into music, and it all started that night.
Such was the power of the Apollo that although he never attended a gig there, it inspired Martin Keelty to write a book on the subject.
It just kept coming up, and of course I'd been aware of it. I was too young to have gone there, but I was always aware that this kind of thing floating about, the history of Glasgow's rock scene, and the website started doing very well, the Apollo Memories website, and I was surfing through that and discovering, you know, just great stories, great memories, and the heart, the passion was dripping out of the website. And the guys that are on the website, Scott and Andy, said, look, we'd love to have a book written, and I said, well, you know, I can see the story here, and it came about from that.
For Tommy McGrory, it was the inspiration for his rock musical, I Was There.
The evidence is, there's a DVD made about it, there's 2 books written about it, there's a BBC programme made about it, hey, there's a rock musical getting made about it as well, and, you know, I'm not bumming my show up, I suppose I am. See the chat that's going about Glasgow right now about this rock musical, it's phenomenal.
Maybe it was its location, maybe it was its size, maybe it was its purple and glitter colour scheme, but from the outset it was clear the Apollo was no ordinary venue. Regular fan Henry Smith often made the trip filled with trepidation.
I remember the kind of film from Queen Street, having got off the train there up to the Apollo, and it seemed to be a succession of little lanes that were always dark and quite sort of menacing. You were always glad to emerge into the light and join the queue. I imagined it to be a huge place, and it was only when you got inside that you actually appreciated how big it was. One of the things that I can remember most is how high the stage was, and if you were sitting near the front, how you had to sit with your neck like that, so you're left with a crick in your neck and you couldn't get your neck down for days, you know.
Just turning the corner from Suckyhall Street into Renfield Street was a kind of magical experience, even in the days of the Greens Playhouse before they had the big sign saying Apollo. And if you went up to the site now, you know, it's now that big cinema complex and the Australian Walkabout Bar. If you were to walk the lane from Renfield Street, you know, just where the pavilion is, if you were to walk the lane down the side of the Apollo where the stage door would have been and come out the other side, which is now, you know, the Royal Console, it would take you, what, 25-30 seconds maximum. But the thing about the Apollo which always amazed me was that when you went up to the door and you showed the guy your ticket and he halved the ticket and let you in, it was like Doctor Who's TARDIS. It seemed to take you like 40 minutes to get from that front door down to your seat, whether it was in the stalls or whether it was up in the circle or the upper circle. It just seemed to take you ages to get there.
I think that's why when it was well, because the Glasgow Choir were quite clear in the fact that we'll tell you what we think of you, and you're not entitled to get away with it just because you've charged a fee or just because you've had an album out.
Yeah, I think it did maybe capture the kind of Glaswegian callousness, because I've seen concerts in Edinburgh, I've seen concerts in London, I've seen concerts in New York, I've seen concerts in Toronto and Stockholm, and none of them has got the passion that there was at the Apollo. I used to laugh at the end when the crowd would start to demand an encore, and when they shouted, "We want more," it wasn't just a polite request, it was a demand. It was a demand, and you knew that if there wasn't more, somebody would have something to say about it.
I would say it's largely a west of Scotland thing, a mixture of Irish and Scottish people. Very gregarious, very noisy, very committed to what they're doing, and you know, you get, it's just, I think it's a little ethnic thing, you know, in the genes, and Glasgow was starved, Scotland as a whole was starved of talent prior to the Apollo. Nobody would come, and they were so appreciative.
If they like a band, they'll let them know. If they didn't like a band, they'd let them know, and it worked.
And that's why if the bands or the performers weren't up to snuff, they got hammered. So everybody knew Glasgow was a tough place to play, and I think the bands
raised their game.
Yeah,
to
I think they
accommodate
all raised their game because they knew if they got it wrong they would get hung out to dry.
I remember when America played, and 80% of the audience were there just to hear Horseman O&M, and they start shouting all the way through, you've had your 2 songs, you've had your 3, come on, just give us a song, boys, that's all we want. And one of the guys on stage says, look, we can't just play Horseman O&M and go off, we're a professional band. And somebody shouts, who tell you that?
The Apollo was great because it could make the career of a band. I mean, I remember going to see Slade, I think it was about 1973, and the opening acts were 2 then pretty unknown bands. One was Susie Quattro, and she came on and sung her set, which included Can the Can, and about 4 or 5 weeks later it was her first #1 UK single. Were Thin Lizzy, and their single at that time was Whiskey in the Jar, and a few years later they came back and were headlining the Apollo in the Live and Dangerous tour. The next time I went to see Slade was even a better example of that. The lights dimmed and this guy came on, and you could see from the age of him that he was like older than your average rock star of the day, so that kind of did not endear him to the audience. So as soon as he walked on, 3,500 people who weren't in the least bit interested in seeing the support and just went into hate mode, and there was all this abuse flying at the stage, and he stood watching them for maybe about 40 seconds, which is a long time not to be doing anything, and he had a sort of red velvet smoking jacket on, which again really wound up the audience, because that was just the kind of thing that rock stars didn't wear then. And he put his foot up in the monitor and glared at the audience. Then he went and took the red velvet smoking jacket off, laid it down, replaced it with a black leather jacket, got a can of McEwen's Pale Ale, and he didn't drink it. He poured it in his hands and slicked his hair back and combed his hair into a kind of DA, and he had this black and white stripy horizontal t-shirt. Now, from the moment that he had walked on stage to the moment that he'd put that leather jacket on and he had a sort of teacher's cane glaring at the audience was probably about a minute and a half. And the crescendo of noise and hate that was just being channeled towards him was frightening. And he just looked at the audience and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, let me introduce you to the sensational Alex Harvey Band." Now, that is the first time I ever saw it. You get booed on and cheered off. They could have got an encore. It was the defining show for the sensational Alex Harvey Band. I mean, if you were to ask them now, sadly Alex is no longer with us, but if you ask the remaining members of the band, what was the show that turned the corner for them as an act? It was that one night when they supported Slade at the Apollo. Noddy Holder still talks about it. He said that Slade had to sit in the dressing room for an extra 30 minutes to let it kind of calm down a bit so that they could go on.
Slade had just had Come On Feel the Noise go straight in at #1. I think that was the Wednesday. I think the concert was the Thursday, and Noddy Holder said, this is our new song. He said, I want all the boys, got to all the girls, give them a good feel. Go on, give them a good feel. The place was an absolute uproar. You hear all these shrieks and howls from all these females. Obviously, people had taken it to heart. The papers a couple of days later said that Noddy had got warned for inciting lewd and libidinous behaviour.
Ozzy Osbourne quite often says that the reason he did his first solo show in Glasgow after having left Black Sabbath was because he had to test himself. If he couldn't cut it in Glasgow, then he was going to have to bow his head and give Tony a call and see if he could rejoin.
I remember once I was interviewing Ozzy Osbourne, and we got in touch with the record company to arrange a time and a venue for the chat, and word came back that Ozzy wanted to do the interview at the Glasgow Apollo. So I phoned the record company guy back, who was an English guy based in London, and I said, I don't think Ozzy realises, but the Apollo has long been demolished. It's now just a gap site. You better make him aware of that. So the guy being English, of course, didn't know the history of the place and went away and told Ozzy's management. But we got another phone call back saying, no, he wants to do it at the Apollo. And I said, but it's a gap site full of rubbish and old bedsteads and pram frames, and it's overgrown with weed and stuff like that. No, he wants to do it at the Apollo. So at 2:30 on the appointed day, this big limo drew up outside the pavilion, and out stepped the minder with Ozzy Osbourne with a big fur coat on or something. And I mean, if nothing else, he looks like a rock star, so he kind of stopped the traffic as this famous guy walked across Renfield Street. We walked down the lane, and there was a gap in the fence which had been sort of smashed by vandals or whatever, and the two of us climbed into the gap site and went down the kind of hill, because it was a kind of almost like a valley now, And believe it or believe it not, he paced out where he thought the stage would be and where he thought his microphone would be on the stage, and when he was happy with the spot, he turned and stood and faced me and went, right, what would you like to know? And we did the interview with Ozzy Osbourne standing on what he thought would have been his spot on the Apollo stage had it still existed. And that was what, that was just, what a big deal it meant to the guy. He still talks about the Apollo to this day, and he wanted to do the interview at the Apollo. The fact that it had been demolished and it was now a gap site was incidental. We had to do it at the Apollo and get all the ghosts coming out the soil and coming up and sort of charging the interview.
It's worth pointing out that although remembered primarily as a rock venue, the Apollo played host to a wide variety of musical genres, from jazz to big band to rock and roll to country, and even to music for which there was no genre, the Wombles. But it was when the Monsters of Rock played that the theatre bounced. Well, at least the balcony did.
I remember Joe Elliott from Def Leppard talking about the first time they played. I think they were supporting Iron Maiden or the Scorpions or something, but they'd heard about this, so they decided, they'd done their support slot and they decided to go up and check out for themselves, and it lasted about 5 minutes. They were like, no, this is just too scary.
A chap that worked in the insurance office beside me had done a building inspection of the Apollo for another insurance company, and he said that people had asked about the bouncing of the front circle, because it moved feet in each direction, and when he'd gone in to do the inspection, he discovered that the beams that go into the side wall were 9 or 10 inches square, but they weren't locked in position in the hole in the wall because they had to be allowed to flex to let the thing bend. And he said, but the support within the hole in the wall was tennis balls.
Is that not an urban myth?
No, it was, I can't really say his name. One of the new business inspectors who worked beside me in an insurance company had said that, because they had about 6 to 8 inches all the way round, and at the ends, of tennis balls, and these got replaced every so many months to make sure that it stayed flexible.
I think the gentleman you're referring to must have been partaking of something else other than bacon and eggs that morning. Yeah, it was just the construction. It was a very long span, and I think, if you could equate it to, right, in Charleston, South Carolina, where I live, and there's a big bridge there, suspension bridge, and it moves. It made me quite scared at times, but the balcony never collapsed.
It was not salubrious, it was not grand or modern or majestic, but the building seemed to have a life of its own, able to inspire and terrify in equal measure. But if the grandeur seemed faded to the average patron, behind the scenes, it was even worse.
I got a job, I was only about 15, as a steward, and you never get paid any money. It was just a kind of voluntary thing because they didn't pay money. But the good thing was you get one of those yellow armbands that said steward on it, and I was one of these annoying gits who had the torch, and when you stood up to dance I shone the torch in your face to tell you to sit down. But I didn't do that for very long. This was really just a device for me to get in there and see the shows, because it was a kind of ageing, decaying cinema, and in those days the dressing room was underneath the stage, so if you were in the dressing room with the band, the headline band, and the support act were on, I mean, it was like being in the middle of some kind of war zone, because all you could hear was this thump, 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 because you were sitting right underneath the drum riser. And I mean, the facilities were Spartan, to say the least. Nothing that would make you want to hang about the dressing room for any length of time. It was just a sort of means to getting in, getting changed, and then, going on stage. And there was a kind of, although it was a kind of decaying place, and there wasn't any sofas or curtains, or even in those days, the bands didn't particularly have very good riders. They never had good food or fruit or vegetables or coffee percolators. It was just basically a crate of beer and some soft drinks and whatever else they brought themselves for the hotel. But there was always that magic moment when they had to leave this kind of run-down, decaying dressing room and go into that famous stage. And the way you did that was you went up this wee kind of windy spiral staircase, and you would see the band, whether it was the Rolling Stones or Bowie or Roxy Music, you would see the band sort of standing in a line, just waiting for the lights to go and to walk on, and then they would walk on and you would hear that roar, and you were really kind of envious of that. I've never been any kind of rock performer and never will, but what kind of feeling must that be to walk from this decaying dressing room that wasn't the greatest place to be hanging about, to walk up this wee sort of skinny, narrow staircase, and then to walk out onto that big, wide, sloping stage that was 50 feet off the ground and be met by the sheer adrenaline rush of 3,500 people going crazy.
Rumours of the Apollo's imminent closure were always doing the rounds, but such was the power and reputation of this truly world-class venue that no one could believe the music would ever end. However, some people had other ideas.
I was getting a lot of heat from the Glasgow City Council at the time, and it was due to the conditions of the snack bar and toilets, which at that time, they were just old. You know, they were built in the 20s. This was the late 70s, and they said, well, we need to do A, B, C, D, and F. And I went away and I got prices for it, and it was a substantial amount of money. And to be honest with you, I really felt that it was a sort of, I don't know, somebody trying to make a name for themselves in the Glasgow Strathclyde Health Park. This is just crazy. So that's how I gave up the initial lease. You know, they sort of pressured me.
And the City Fathers had a terrible thing against it. They didn't want something like this to exist, and if it had to exist, they didn't want it in the city centre. And they promised for years that the concert hall would be the natural successor to the Apollo, and it quite obviously isn't. The SEC is, you know, a lot of bands play there, but it's more like a shed than, you know, a glittery brick encasement of the Glasgow ethos.
The politics at the time, of course, in 1985 when the Apollo shut down, the SECC was opening up, so there wasn't a lot of political or business will to compete with a 10,000 seated arena that was getting built.
Well, I was absolutely heartbroken when they closed the doors and announced that it was going to be demolished, because there was some times when I spent maybe 5-6 nights a week in the place, and I just loved the place. I mean, you know, had the Apollo done bed and breakfast, I think I would have lived there.
My heart sank. I just thought, no, because it wasn't getting any support from the council, it wasn't getting any funding. The Theatre Royal, the City Hall, you know, all these other places were getting backing, and the Apollo got hee-haw. My wee sister started a petition, and we got all sorts of bands. We got Gordon Giltrap, Tangerine Dream, Roxy Music, The Motors, Wishbone Ash, and various others. And people in Manchester went to the Manchester Apollo and went backstage and got the band to sign a petition, and then they posted it up to us.
By now it was apparent there was to be no rising from the ashes. The Apollo was doomed. So doomed that the BBC commissioned a documentary to record its passing. What did director Liz Scott feel when she entered the building?
I think my first thoughts were, I hope this remains standing so that we can finish the programme. And honestly, I don't think we would have been allowed nowadays to film in there because of health and safety reasons. I mean, the place was a mess. It smelled. When you walked into this big grand entrance, the roof was hanging down. You were sticking to the floor. It was just awful. It was like a demolition site. And as I say, I don't think we would have been allowed to film nowadays in it. And at that time, there was an order on it for demolition. That's why we were making the programme. Then there was talk of it opening again, but it couldn't have. They let it go. It was a shame. They let it go. It was very nostalgic when we left. And handing the keys over to the demolition guys. We made a wee event of the Apollo.
The death warrant was signed, the Apollo was coming down. It was a dirty job, but somebody had to do it. John MacDonald, then of Burnt Hills Demolition.
I was the contracts director of Burnt Hills at the time when we were given the contract to take the Apollo Theatre down. There was two ways of looking at it. One was it was sad that the Apollo Theatre was getting taken down, but two, to be given the contract to tackle one of the biggest jobs in Scotland was actually quite an honour, you know. When we went in, it was in a sorry state. It was quite sad actually, because it probably had very little repairs or leaks in the roof looked at for many a year, and when we went in, the place was actually rotten with damp. I can still visualise the black stage and the black curtains and all the rest of it there. Our guys that come in to do the demolition and strip the building out and do all the preparation work. It was amazing. They were dancing along the stage, air guitars, thinking they were Rod Stewart and all the rest of it. It was a bit of fun to be had as well at the time. It was a very, very difficult building to take down. Very difficult because of the height of it and the proximity to the roads. and the buses and everything else. It was extremely difficult. So it was actually like we were double shifting it. We had to work during the day doing the preparation and then during the night to actually demolish certain sections of it because it was so difficult. It would probably take us somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 weeks. Actually, when we demolished the Apollo Theatre, a lot of the stage and a lot of the building would have probably gone into the old dockside building down where the SEC Centre is. All the rubble and all the rest of it used to go down because Glasgow City Council had a landfill down there. It used to be the old docks, and that got infilled, and part of the Apollo Theatre was taken to those old docks.
So the Apollo was gone. Would it ever be forgotten?
I actually did come back during the demolition, towards the end of it, and I climbed onto the rubble and I took a piece of the plaster work, and I still have it. I gave it to my wife, Linda, and she has it. So it's just about a 3-inch square piece of concrete with purple paint on it.
Coming together a lot of people, it's a great feeling, and of course music just tops it off. Music makes you move, it makes you feel, it makes you cry, you know, all these emotions goes on. That's what music's for.
In my memory, whether it's accurate or not, is that there was a major world-renowned band playing at the Apollo every week. And if you look at Glasgow now, that's just not the case.
Glasgow is worse off without it. It's not just the fact that I've grown older. I still think if I was going to concerts in the Apollo, I would feel more of the fire in my belly.
When you think about it, you pay more at the SECC car park than you did for a ticket at the Apollo. Can't believe that.
It's supposed to be nostalgic. It's another part of the Scottish and principally the Glaswegian psyche that you want to be able to say, it's gone, you can't have it, it's part of us, it's away. And I think as well, if it was still here, you'd have certain people of a certain age going, I don't go to that Apollo anymore, it's not what it used to be. And can you imagine if they had noise limiters or, you know, Beyonce playing or, you know, Britney Spears playing? It was past its time, but it fought hard and it lived maybe 3 or 4 years longer than it should have done. And I think for any Glaswegian attitude, that's enough. It proved it. You want me dead, I'm going to fight on for another 4 years. There, proved it. Right, now I'm going.
The Apollo belonged to Glasgow. It was our place.
Nothing will ever touch that place. Nothing will ever touch the sheer magic of the Apollo. I mean, you could go to the farthest flung corner of the world and meet a fellow Scot, and if you found you were into music, I bet you within 10 minutes of having a conversation with you, he'd say, did you ever go to the Apollo? Who did you see there? I remember going to see such and such. Now, you know, that wouldn't happen with the Royal Concert Hall. It wouldn't happen with the SEC. It wouldn't happen with the O2 Academy. It just wouldn't happen. The Apollo was a part of the fabric of life. You know, I don't think anybody could have gone there and come away saying, I went to the Apollo to see so-and-so. I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't have a good night. Everybody had a great time there.
No regrets whatsoever. I thought it was the most important thing that I've done in my life, and it was actually the best time of my life.
The Temple of Apollo was produced by Philip Differ and is a Wes Fargo jangle production for BBC Radio Scotland.